Hello and welcome to a special episode of Shattered Lives Reach Ireland's crime podcast for the Irish Mirror and Irish Daily Star. I'm crime and defence editor Michael O'Toole. I'm going to say you're me. And I'm joined as ever by our crime correspondent Paul Healy. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Mick.
So, it will come as no surprise to anybody that Jozef Puska has been found guilty of the murder of Ashling Murphy.
Yeah, I think, although we can't assume the thoughts of everyone, I would say that anyone who sat in that trial for the past 16 days, for the past 4 weeks, would come to the conclusion, if they hadn't come to the conclusion in the first 2 days, to be honest with you, that he is the murderer. As he said in his own words, I am the murderer. He confessed to the murder of Ashling Murphy in hospital. Well, what more evidence do you need? Well, you've got DNA, you've got CCTV, you've got the whole 9 yards. An extraordinary case and a momentous day for the family of Ashling Murphy today, now that Mr. Puska has finally been convicted.
So he will serve a life sentence. There is only one sentence in Ireland for murder, and that's a mandatory life sentence. Now, we've spoken about this on previous pods, that it's what's called an indeterminate sentence. So a determinate sentence is you could get 7 years or 9 years, and you know that you'll get remission. It'll be normally 25%. It may be what they call enhanced remission of 33%, and then everything's backdated to when they go into custody. But this is an indeterminate sentence, so it's life. Now, we do know a couple of things. At the moment, the average sentence that a lifer serves in Ireland is, I think, 20 years and maybe 2 months. It does go up. It does seem to go up every year. Remember when I started off a long time ago, people were getting released after 7 years. But this is an average. So obviously, if it's an average, some people will serve less than 20 years and some people will serve more. I put it to you, Paul, that it's a given that Puska will serve more than 20 years.
Yeah, I think it's a given. It comes down, a lot of your time in prison comes down to your behavior in prison and how you engage with services and whether you accept your guilt, your culpability. And I think if Puska's behavior in court is any measure to go by, although maybe he'll have a sudden change of heart and gain a conscience when he's in prison, but I think he will maintain that he is innocent of this crime for some time. That's not going to help him. I think just even given the gravity of the crime and its nature, its infamous nature, I mean, this is one of these crimes that has affected the whole country. So yeah, I don't think you're going to see the likes of Puska out for 20 years plus, if not more.
Yeah, and I did speak about this on a previous pod. The late Brian Lenihan, when he was Justice Minister, so it must have been maybe 2008, he took some of us for lunch. And he spoke about Joe O'Reilly, and he said Joe O'Reilly will serve 20 years. Now, the minister, he's now deceased, God love him, I don't think he was too far off. So O'Reilly has done 16 years, hasn't he? So it's July 2007. It'll be a while yet before he gets released. But I think it's fair to say Puska is and this is probably the wrong word, but there's a pantheon of killers and murderers who are the Tier A, shall we say, who are facing the possibility of the rest of their lives behind bars. And I think he's one of them. I think Graham Dwyer might be one as well, just because the murders are so infamous.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm just thinking as you're mentioning those names, it's funny the way that this trial was covered. And in a way, perhaps maybe this is the right way that a trial should be phrased. I mean, this has often been referred to as the Ashling Murphy trial or the Ashling Murphy case, where the victim's name is the one that's prominent in the coverage. Because I think everybody was affected by the murder of Ashling Murphy. And, she was the everyday Irish girl, young Irish girl, whole life ahead of her, a musician, school teacher. She has that Irish name, a huge Irish traditional music background, and from a part of Tullamore, which celebrates all of that. And so she encompasses many things for many people. I mean, I think a lot of people can maybe see their sister or their daughter or their friend or their school teacher in Ashling Murphy. And so, in a way, the way the media has covered this as well, I think, has reflected that, in that we've called it the Ashling Murphy trial. So Jozef Puska kind of took a backseat, and probably still will. Like, the coverage over the next couple of days will be all about Ashling, really, not about Jozef Puska. And in a way, maybe that's good. That's great. Maybe that's the way we need to cover it in future. I mean, you're talking about Dwyer and O'Reilly. It was all about Graham Dwyer and Joe O'Reilly, and less so about their victims. And so, yeah, maybe that's the way these things are going to be covered in future. Please God, there aren't more cases like this, because this was probably one of the more random things to ever happen. I remember, we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but I remember when this happened, and just like, I mean, we cover all types of crime, but there was just something particularly grotesque and truly evil about this particular crime, and the pure random nature of it. All murders are bad, but just the randomness of this, I think, just exacerbated how awful a crime it was.
I found it very upsetting, I have to say. And I can still remember the day. Maybe, I mean, we got to hear about it, I think, maybe 6 o'clock.
Early on.
And yeah, it was because so she was murdered. It was around 3:20, really. Yeah, so look, I think within a couple of hours, we definitely knew at maybe 6 o'clock, 6:30. And obviously, various details come out. And I think I remember talking to you about this, Paul. I can remember we had a name, and we knew she was a teacher. And I'm getting very upset thinking about this, but one thing I always find very upsetting is, and we have to do it, and we make no apologies, but we find pictures of the deceased, because pictures are very important, because they are the essence of the person. It's that old cliche about a picture being worth a thousand words. And we always strive to get a picture, because, and you and I know that victims' families have often given us pictures because they want the people to see the person. And I remember we got the name and the teacher, and I found her photograph, and we got it ID'd. And I just remember looking at her and going, oh, Jesus Christ, that poor girl. Because she was a girl. She's a woman, but she was just starting off in her life. And I always find, I don't know about you, Paul, we never really spoke about this. Do you find it upsetting when you find a photograph? Personally, when I find a photograph, I go, I hope it's not her, or I hope it's not him. Have you ever done that?
Yeah, I mean, not that you weigh any one particular person over another, but yeah, I suppose when you see photographs of someone so full of life, and you can see that with Ashling Murphy. There were videos. I remember I actually was only looking at it the other day. There was a video of her with her sister Amy, with her violin, and they're just performing. And I think there's something in particular about a video, whatever, about seeing pictures. It's just, you see her so full of life and happy. And I think the social media post was, the sisters were never happier than when they were together and playing music. And I think we saw, that was one of the first things we saw when we're looking at pictures and videos, and realizing that she was the victim in this case. And it was just so shocking, harrowing, really. You can see you could just see her whole life it was just ripped from her, and from her family. And then there were photographs of her with her boyfriend, I remember, and he put up a social media post that was Ryan. And he put up a social media post talking about his devastation of losing her. And just, yeah, it makes it so real when you see, and she was heavily involved in GAA there as well, and just for part of a huge community. You could see all of that in the pictures before you even spoke to anybody that knew her. You could see the incredible life that she had, and it was only just starting.
And then the next day, I think it was the next day, the 14th, I was definitely down there, and we went to Durham National School where she taught. And I that was very hard, because there were lovely people. I think the principal and senior, maybe the vice principal, come out and spoke to us, and they were absolutely fantastic. But there were kids running around, and I remember thinking, God, those poor kids, I wonder if any of them were taught by Miss Murphy. I found it very difficult. Do you know what else I found difficult? And this, I found it difficult reading about the case when I wasn't covering it. Does that make sense? So with, we use a filter of, we're professional and we're in the case and we're tweeting away. But when I was reading your tweets, I found some of them very hard, I have to say, because I'm looking at it through a person and not a journalist. Does that make sense?
And this, as I say, she was a young girl and a young Irish girl, and that's why, as I say, she seems to be, I mean, not that one person is the same as another, but so many people have daughters and sisters, as I say, and friends like Ashling Murphy, and I think that's what makes this as harrowing as it is. And then, as I said, the random nature of it, the fact that she was just going out for a run that day. I mean, I'm sure that your daughters go out for a run, Mick. I'm sure that other fathers listening to this know about their daughters going out at night and going for a run and worrying, are they going to come home? This was in the middle of the day, broad daylight. I mean, that's the thing that's kind of hard to even get your head around, that. And in a very public place, like you're talking about a public walkway there where there were plenty of people around and plenty of witnesses in this case that were within seconds of the attack. And yet Jozef Puska was able to get her in to the bushes there and attack her in the way that he did and kill her within a matter of minutes, seconds even.
And I think even, we might talk about this later, with all the rumours that were going around the place.
Mm-hmm.
I think
which
part
didn't
of that
help.
No, they completely didn't help, and they were completely wrong. And I think people sort of want to see a connection, because it's very hard for people to understand that there can be random killings like this. So when we first heard about Miss Murphy, or we first heard about a lady killed on the canal, first question I remember asking sources was, well, did you know him?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I remember being told, yeah, but possibly we think so, because it's so early and it's so very early on, maybe there was some connection, but there wasn't. And, there were all these rumours, we can talk about this now, that Ashling had a connection, or that Miss Murphy had a connection to Puska in some way involving his kids, that his kids may have been at her school and all that sort of stuff. And the rumours are doing all the rounds. We were watching them during the trial. This was a random murder. Anne-Marie Lawler, on the opening, said there was no connection between Miss Murphy and Jozef Puska. And I think you were there when it was said again. It was said a couple of times in the court. There was zero connection. This was a stranger murder.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for people to accept that.
Yeah, I mean, even to this day, people on social media were putting up conspiracy theories, unhelpful conspiracy theories in the midst of this trial, not realizing they could potentially collapse a trial and putting out said conspiracy theories, by the way, trying to ascertain that there was some sort of connection. Regardless of whether there was a connection, this is still a horrific murder, but there was no connection between the two. And I think that's what made it even more shocking, the nature of it. And we don't know why. Will we ever know why?
I think we do. Well, yes, that's the point.
We have suspicions as to why,
yes.
But only Jozef Puska knows really what happened, and as to we know because of a lot of other circumstances, when it happened and where it happened, and that he's responsible for it, but we don't. Apart from perhaps maybe the obvious assumption that you would make, the horrible assumption that you would make as to why he did it.
Yes, and that's what I'm sort of trying to say, that I think people seek comfort or explanations and whys for these things. And the truth is, I think there is a why. I think it was a sexual-oriented crime. I think, was it Jenna Stack said he's going to rape her? Was it Jenna Stack or Aoife Marin?
Jenna Stack believed that Ashling Murphy was being, or about to be, raped in that moment. Yeah, and that was.
And I think she was
that
right.
Was heard by the trial. I think that possibly was the motivation. Thank God. That is. I mean, it sounds even strange saying that, because look, obviously she was murdered and obviously fought for her life and obviously had a horrific death. But there was a pathologist evidence given, and there's some things you don't report, but needless to say, there was no sign of any intrusion in relation to that. So obviously, Mr. Puska was not successful in sexually assaulting Ashling Murphy. But yeah, I'd say you could be, given his MO as such, going around following women as he was that day, and certainly what we've been hearing from our sources, the belief is that certainly he was looking to rape somebody that day.
I can say with certainty that Gardaí believed this, that he had rape on his mind that whole day. So I think the motive was sexual. I think Gardaí would believe very strongly, they would be convinced that this was a sexually motivated crime. You're absolutely. Let's get into this, Paul. Have you ever seen a more open and shut case?
No, I mean, I think it's extraordinary, and it speaks to the arrogance of Jozef Puska that that we went through a whole trial of this, because usually, and you could imagine the scenario, I'm sure it happened in this case, where someone is so banged to rights guilty that their counsel, their solicitors would be saying to them, listen, you're better off pleading here. But maybe it speaks to the arrogance of Jozef Puska that he brought this to trial. You're talking about everything was against him: DNA, CCTV, and his own words, where he actually straight up confessed to the murder, and then had the arrogance to eventually take the stand himself after basically clearly not being happy with the way he'd been defended throughout the trial. He then thought that his own story, which no one had heard up until the trial, would somehow help him. I think if anything, that was the final nail in the coffin, because it was already so many things. And I could probably say to you that by the time that Jenna Stack really took the stand, which I think was on the third day, I was convinced of his guilt. But by the time it came to him on the stand, I mean, I think he really, all doubt was erased from anybody's minds.
I'm going to say I was convinced of his guilt after Anne-Marie Lawler, who's the senior counsel for the state, the chief prosecutor, after her opening. Her opening was fantastic. And I was powerful. There for that. And I was privileged to be there for that. And she just laid everything on the table for the jury and for us. And it was like, we were sitting in the press bench and we were going, this fella is banjaxed. So you and I, and we did sort of hear whispers that he was going to take to the stand. And I think there was a view that the way that the prosecution had been framing things, there was an inevitability that he would take to the stand. The natural corollary was, if they're saying this, this, and this, that he was trying to help her, for example, then really he has to take to the stand. But were you surprised when he took to the witness stand?
I would say, so on the day that Jenna Stack gave her evidence, on the third day, Michael Bowman, senior counsel defending Jozef Puska, said, he put it to the witness. So she was describing how she witnessed Jozef Puska on top of Ashling Murphy, and how she believed Miss Murphy was being attacked. And that's when we heard Michael Bowman say, I put it to you that he was assisting Miss Murphy. And that is the first time that we heard that position. That was Jozef Puska's position, that he was helping her. So that, I remember that there was a shocked reaction in the courtroom when that happened, because you don't get an indication of what the defense's position is. And we were curious as to what is his defense going to be in this case. And it was on that day that we heard for the first time that what he's saying is, I was on top of her. Yeah, that's me that you saw on top of her, but I wasn't killing her. I was actually trying to help her. Well, the second we heard that, we thought, there's only one person who's going to be able to prove that, and it's going to be him. So I think from that moment on, we thought he has to give evidence. But there was a shift. There was a kind of a paradigm shift towards the end, where on the day that he actually did take the witness stand, I can talk about this now, but there was a lot of kerfuffle and panic in the morning time, and back and forth between the prosecution and the defense in and out of the courtroom. And then there was discussions with the judge, and it was like, if this is going to go the way that you're now saying it is, then, just be sure that your client is aware of the situation and all of that. So it's more than a guesstimate. My interpretation of what was happening that day was that they had decided not to have him on the stand, and that there had been a last minute decision then by him. I'm taking the stand. I certainly got the impression that he had been talked out of it, and then he was almost demanding that he get back on that he get on the stand, because there seemed to be a lot of panic and confusion, and the prosecution didn't appear to be overly prepared for the possibility of cross-examining him that day. So I got the impression, in spite of the fact that we thought it might happen, that it wasn't going to happen. And then he made a last minute decision to get on the witness stand.
And tell me this, Paul, you were there for, it was over 2 days that he was given evidence, in direct evidence and in cross-examination. And we got a lot of messages during the trial, and I don't answer them because I don't talk about trials when they're on, asking how he looked and everything. And I'll be totally honest with you, I was too busy taking notes to have a good look at him. I very, very rarely looked at him. What was his demeanor like? Firstly, what you maybe looked at him more than me. Your type might be better than mine, but you probably may have looked at him more because you were at the trial more than me. You may have got a good eyeful of him. So, what was your view of him while he was in the dock, and what was your view of him when he was in the witness stand?
There's a couple of times where I couldn't help but look at him because I thought that his mannerisms were so bizarre. I mean, you'd look at him for a second and you'd go, is he smiling? You know? And then I remember actually, I asked a couple of my colleagues, because you might not want to lose the run of yourself and think that he's smiling. Several of my colleagues in court noted that he was smiling and smirking his way through the whole trial. And every time that I would look at him, 9 times out of 10, he just had this smirk on his face and this look of pure arrogance, to be quite honest with you. When he would come out into the courtroom, before he would sit down, his family members would be sitting down the back and he would wink at them and smile at them. And just kind of, it looked like he didn't have a care in the world. Never really looked particularly serious. There was only one day where there was a notable change in his demeanor. And that was, so on the 12th day of the trial, he failed to show up. We can now talk about this. It was said in the absence of the jury that Mr. Puska was sick that day, and a sick note had been handed in from Cloverhill Prison. When he showed up then the next day, on the 13th, he looked completely different. So throughout the whole trial, he had his hair tied back in a... So people will probably see the photographs in the papers from when he was arrested. And the description of him, you know, when he was arrested was very different to how he looked in the courtroom, because he had a shaved head and he had a beard when he attacked Ashling Murphy. But in court, he was completely clean shaven and he had long hair, which was tied into a bun. But on the 13th day, he came out with the hair down. The hair bobbin was gone. And to me and to my colleagues who were in the courtroom, it looked as though he had just spent an hour sobbing. Because I don't know if when you see somebody who's been crying, you can just tell with their face, he just looked like he had been in floods of tears. And that was the only day where there was a notable, complete change in his demeanor. And also the way that he appeared, obviously, with the hair down. And I remember a family member, he waved to a family member looking for a hair bobbin. And the prison guard actually said, no, there's no way, that's not happening. No. And he wasn't given the hair bobbin. So that was a bit curious. But that was the only day. Every other day, I thought he looked very confident, smiling and smirking when he was sitting in the dock. And then when he was actually on the witness stand, very calm demeanor. It's just arrogance. He just displayed arrogance. He displayed the appearance and the charisma of somebody who just firmly believed that the jury would find him not guilty.
So let me ask you this. Did he look under pressure? Look, I'm sure everybody has at one stage in their life lied. Okay, it happens, right? Or you're in the doo-doo and you're trying to explain and you're like, so, some of us aren't very good at that, right? Some are. Did he look like a man under pressure when he was coming up with this fairy story?
That's a hard one to tell because, to be honest, now I'm going to use the excuse of I was typing too much because every single word he was saying I was trying to take down. But I would say that he seemed to be telling a story that in some ways seemed rehearsed. And as Anne-Marie Lawler said to him, you've had 18 months to come up with this story. His response to that, by the way, was, yeah, I have had 18 months to come up with the story. So a lot of his answers were said very confidently. But when you thought about them for half a second, even in the moment after he said it, it was like, well, that doesn't make sense. Or that's a direct contradiction of what he just said a second ago. So there was a lot of I do think the general story was rehearsed in that he was saying, I was stabbed in Tullamore and that I didn't tell the guards and I lied about it being in Blanchardstown. But I think the finer details he hadn't worked out. But his default answer when he was caught out in his lies was, well, the Jonathan Dowdall excuse, well, I lied then, but I'm not lying now. That was basically his default. It's like, well, when you've caught me out in a lie, I'll admit that I was lying, but I'm not lying now. That was his get out of jail sort of, although it hasn't got him out of jail, but that seemed to be his approach to the whole thing.
So I observed him in the case when I could, but I didn't hear him speaking. Does he have a confident voice? Does he have a really weak voice? What's his voice like?
He's a quiet voice and he speaks quite quickly. Yeah. I mean, the interpreter was struggling to keep up with him, I think, a little bit. That's what I was to say. His story seemed relatively rehearsed. Like he spent the last couple of months in prison. Oh, by the way, he's been in prison this whole time. That's another thing the jury are not told. I mean, they might make assumptions, but he's actually been on remand in prison this entire time. But yeah, just speaks quite quickly.
And I'm just thinking about various things, and somebody mentioned this to me earlier. I saw the CCTV, but it was played for you. Did you see the CCTV of him walking? I think was it a taxi from at his parents' house on the night of the murder of Ashling into his parents' house in Crumlin? Did you see? It was a blue car. Do you remember?
Yes, I do remember that. Yeah.
So you see him walking, and he walks quite confidently and strongly and firmly from the car to the house. It's about 15 seconds, so it's good. And he's walking towards the camera, so it's face on, right? Gardaí believe he stabbed himself in his parents' house. And it's the only logical thing, because when the guards from Crumlin, who were first at the house, when they went in, he was holding himself. He was not injured when he was walking from that car to his parents' house. It was 5 to 12, I think, on the 12th. So the belief would be that's when he started concocting his story, and he stabbed himself then.
Yeah, and I mean, that tallies with the evidence. I mean, it was more or less suggested in the trial because there was a lot of questioning about his injuries and how bad the bleeding was and all of that. He was claiming, where do you start with his claims? But he was claiming that he was attacked in Blanchardstown the night before.
So the night of, so a couple of hours after the murder of Ashling.
Yes, on the 12th. Which means that he's saying he went from Tullamore to Blanchardstown, got stabbed in Blanchardstown, went home to Crumlin to his parents. He felt as though he wasn't injured badly enough that he needed to see a doctor, and then that the next day he started to feel unwell and the ambulance was called. Then when he got on the stand, it was, I was stabbed the day of by Ashling Murphy's murderer, and I didn't tell anyone, including my parents, because I was afraid that he might come after me, was his excuse.
So it might be worth drilling down on the evidence he gave. You were there for both days, because when reading your tweets, it was, and I mean this in its literal sense, it was a fantastical story. In other words, for me, it was fantasy. And again, I know we always say this. I think when you're working on a case like this, you don't really get that much time to think because you're too busy working, and it's a filter, I think, to protect us and photographers. We see a lot of things, but when you stopped to think about it, did you go, "This is bullshit"?
Yeah, multiple times. Well, the second, I was just explaining to you about about him being stabbed. I mean, that was the biggest hole in the story. I mean, you're talking about actual stab wounds here, holes in his stomach. Well, there was a hole in the story. I mean, he was trying to make us believe that he told the guards in hospital on the 13th of January, the day after Ashling Murphy was killed, that he was stabbed in Blanchardstown. He was then trying to have us believe that he conveniently forgot the events of the 14th, the day after, where he confessed to the murder of Ashling Murphy. Under pressure, he accepted that it's a possibility that he might have said that, but he can't remember it. Which, that was a part I remember in my head going, well, have we not caught him out there then? Because he's actually sort of saying, I might have confessed to murder, and he's just casually forgotten about it. And like, that's a totally normal thing that happens, that you casually confess to murder and you forget about it. Then he remembers again that the interviews that he had with Gardaí on the 17th and the 18th in Tullamore Garda Station. And he remembers, when asked about that, he says he just felt like he didn't want to tell the guards the truth. He didn't want to tell his family the truth, that he had allegedly been stabbed by Ashling Murphy's murderer. That for the last 18 months, up until he sat on the stand, he was actually the victim of an attack, according to him, that he kept that secret, that he decided that he was the only person who witnessed the murder of Ashling Murphy, And whilst on remand in prison and was charged with her murder, he didn't bring any of this up until right now. I mean, that to me was like, just, I mean, stop talking, because you've just hung yourself.
Was the thrust of the evidence, or did he effectively claim that Miss Murphy saw him being attacked and went over to help him? Because I was slightly confused by that.
He was saying that he came up to this flyover at the N52 by Digby after crossing Digby Bridge, and that this fella came out of nowhere with a face mask on, that he shouted at him, that he abused him in some way verbally, but he didn't fully understand him, that he knocked him off his bike. This is another thing, by the way. He said that he was walking with the bike, but then he said this guy knocked him off the bike. So the story wasn't consistent. This is what I mean. He had a rehearsed story, but he would trip himself up in his own story. This guy knocked him off the bike. Then he says Ashling Murphy appeared like an apparition, and started talking to him while he was on the ground, while this guy was on top of him. And then this guy got up off him, went after her, and while he was there with 3 stab wounds, he managed to stand up, go over, peek into the bushes, see this guy attacking her. This guy runs off. He goes over and he looks at her, and he says that he got her scarf and that he put the scarf around her neck and that he tried to save her. Well, then cross-examination, it's put to him. So then you knew she was dying. You knew she'd been the victim of an attack. You knew that she was dying there in front of you, and you watched her die. And his like, rather than having a normal human response to that, like, oh, like, you know, like, I mean, if he was completely innocent, why didn't he call the guards or anything like that? He basically said that he did know she was dying. He said he knew she was dying, and that he ran away. He jumped into some fields and then got into a ditch and passed out for 3 or 4 hours. And then when he woke up, he saw the Garda sirens, the blue lights and sirens, and his next choice was to go in the opposite direction of the blue lights and sirens. Again, this is all totally, completely normal behavior, supposedly, for somebody who is the victim of a crime and the only witness to a murder.
And there's a couple of things that jumped out at me when he's given, or when there was evidence given about what he said happened to him in Blanchardstown. And it's always the description, right? If you notice, it was 1.8 meters. So I'm 1.74. So average height, basically, right? So 5'8", 5'9", dressed in dark clothing. You could give one description. It's always, well, you know, it was normal height and stuff, because they can't process something and they can't make something up, and they can't remember it. So what you said there jumped out at me about, he was on a bike, he was wheeling the bike, and then he was off the bike. So when you're lying, and this is why I'm particularly crap at it, you have to remember things. So he couldn't remember what he was lying about.
Yeah. And when he would be almost thrown a ball, he'd take it, you know, like, I mean, he had a version of, so it was put to him in cross-examination about, so after he did all of what I've just explained to you, what he said he did, he ran to a family friend and he asked for a lift home. And the evidence that the court heard was that when the family friend brought him to his home in Mucklagh, he asked him to slow down. So he said in his own evidence to the court, that he asked him to slow down because he thought that Ashling Murphy's killer, the person who'd attacked him, might be there in waiting for him. And then the prosecuting barrister, Anne-Marie Lawler, said, well, were you not concerned about the guards being there because a murder had just happened and that they might be looking for you, and because your bike was at the scene? And he kind of jumped on that, like, unexpectedly, because this didn't help him, but he went, well, yeah, that's the reason. So suddenly he had no, I wasn't because I was concerned that the killer would be waiting there for me. It's because I was concerned that the guards might be there waiting for me. So he admitted that quite easily in cross-examination. And I think in his own arrogant mind, he thought that was helping him. If anything, that actually was even worsening his case even further, because he was acknowledging, well, actually, when I just told you a second ago the reason why I asked him to slow down, and then you offered an alternative theory, that's actually the reason. So he was just caught up in a web of his own lies.
Just one interesting thing, he did say that he came to after several hours in a ditch. See, I wonder, we know that he was on CCTV from 9 o'clock that night in Tullamore, and it's sort of quite close to where he had been around Tesco, where he'd been following these 2 other women earlier about 2:00. So from 3:30 to 9:00, he was somewhere. And he was obviously in the Tullamore area. So he must have been laying low for 6 hours, really, because he went to that fella's house just about 9:00, Peter. So he was somewhere, obviously, because he had to get a lift home. I wonder where he was.
It's a curious thing, and we don't really know. We only have his version of events, which is that he supposedly passed out in a drain for 3 or 4 hours. Maybe he was hiding in the drain for 3 or 4 hours. We don't know. I recall that there were 2 witnesses that spoke to seeing him near the recycling plant, hunched over. That's another thing. There were several things that he gave in his own evidence that I felt like he'd come up with after hearing in the trial. So he'd heard 2 people say that. So then he said, he had an explanation for, I was hunched over because I was in pain because I'd been stabbed. So he kind of came up with theories for each piece of evidence that he'd heard over the last 13 or whatever days on the spot.
Yes, that was that. If I recall, that was a lady who was going. She was working, but she was a student, and she was going in to print stuff out. So I think it was about 7:30. And I think that was near the college. So it was still in the centre of Tullamore, basically. And it's near, do you remember the recycling bin? That was an issue because I can remember at the time that they took that recycling bin because they were looking for the weapon. And that's maybe we should talk about this. This is another conspiracy or whatever about people not knowing about the stabbing. We, on the week of the murder, one of our front page stories was that they were looking for the murder weapon. And we knew that the water unit was in the air. We saw them. And we knew that the recycling bin that I was speaking about had been taken away, because I think we were there when it was taken away. So we would have, how can I put this? We would have had a belief that a weapon was used, a knife was used in it, and that the guards were looking for it. So there was no big conspiracy yet, another conspiracy doing the rounds. But I mean, we definitely, one of our, I think on the 16th, maybe a couple of days later, was that they were looking for the murder weapon. So we can put that to bed as well, that we were part of some big grand conspiracy. If only people knew the truth about journalism. And it's this, guards don't tell us things. They try not to tell us things.
And by the way, just on that, there was a conspiracy theory of, why the media reported her death in the manner in which it was reported, which, I mean, there was a theory that Ashling Murphy had been strangled. Yeah. And there was a suspicion of that. There was actually a legitimate suspicion of that. And it came up in the trial that the pathologist who gave evidence said that there was possibly compression marks, but the cause of her death ultimately was the 11 stab wounds. But as you say, guards don't have to speak to journalists, and it's incredible how, I suppose, tight that information was kept, because that came out in the trial. No one reported, to my knowledge, that Ashling Murphy was stabbed 11 times. So that key detail of the investigation was kept very much tight and under wraps, in spite of.
And look, I'll be honest. I think my story at the time said she'd possibly been stabbed. So we did not know that her cause of death was stabbing. I have to be honest. But that again, we have to find stuff sort of despite. It's an uphill battle every day to find information. So we had a certain level of knowledge. But we didn't know, but we knew that there had been a knife or a bladed weapon used in the attack, and that they were looking for it.
Yeah, sorry. We knew that, but we didn't know the finer details of the 11 stab wounds and that. But look, people come up with conspiracy theories in the absence of the facts, unfortunately, sadly.
And the reason that the conspiracy theories fester is because once someone appears in court, for us, the shutters come down. You can say deadly squat, right? But nature abhors the vacuum, and people will. Like, do you remember at the time that there was a rumour that a Syrian asylum seeker had handed himself in?
Yeah.
And it was doing the rounds everywhere on WhatsApp, and it was complete nonsense.
I think to be like this was huge. I just want to kind of take us back to the day that this happened and the days following it, and just what it was like reporting on it, because this was insanity. I've never experienced anything like this in my career. This was the biggest story that I probably have ever covered. Biggest crime story that I've covered in recent years. I don't know about you, Mick. I'm sure you've covered some of the big ones, but this was huge. But I say that because the reaction to Ashling Murphy's death was extraordinary, and I think as a result of that, the guards were under a serious amount of pressure. And I just want to take people behind the scenes to the insanity of this, but they were. I mean, some people have criticized the guards because of this, which I think is extraordinary, because they were just doing their dogged work to get the guy as quick as they could. And unfortunately, they arrested the wrong man. Now, evidence came out in the trial about this, but the description of the suspect did match a particular individual who was of interest to the guards. It's not like he was a complete nobody. He was somebody of interest to the guards. And this person was completely cleared, has no involvement in the murder of Ashling Murphy whatsoever. But in those key 24 hours, as you know, Mick, they have to do what they have to do. And they questioned this man. They had reason to question this man. And he was ultimately released. Now, that was a bombshell for us, because I've never experienced anything like this, where you are covering something, you've got somebody under arrest, and it's coming right up to the 11th hour before we're about to go to print, where our paper is going to bed for the night, and we have the story, the headline, everything. And I think you're going to tell me now in a second, but I certainly know that there was a discussion about naming this individual the next day as well, that he was the person under arrest. And then all of a sudden, at 10 o'clock at night, we're told something's going to happen here, hold off printing, and the individual was released.
Yes, it was. It's happened occasionally to me, but it was, and I've had to ring our desk and say, hold the front page, right? Maybe 5 times in my career. That was a hold the front page moment, because we did get an indication around 10 o'clock. And do you remember, we were all talking about this going, we weren't naming anybody, but there was certain bits of information we were going to lead off on. And I'd written the story. The story was grand. It was ready to rock and roll. And we got indication, maybe, I think you're right, about 10 o'clock. So we're going, what the hell? Okay, it's going to be something big. But it was 5 to 11 when we got the confirmation. The guards issued a press release, and this was a, oh my God moment. It was frenzied. And there's somebody who I think did a massive favour and a massive service to journalism, because if all the papers had various angles, and if that we didn't know about that man being exculpated and released, it would have been catastrophic for an awful lot of papers. Is that fair?
It would have been, and it would have been somewhat catastrophic to the Garda investigation as well. So it didn't help anybody, the situation. But I think with all the facts now that we've heard, and the absolute frenzied nature of the attack and the panic that was happening in Tullamore and the national attention on it, I think the guards were under a certain level of pressure. And unfortunately, this man, he fit the description of the suspect. I mean, it was uncanny. But there's no connection whatsoever. There's no suggestion of any involvement. But there was an incredible likeness and a reason for arresting him that day.
Yes, and Anne-Marie Lawler was very keen to point this out. I don't want to misquote her, but it was a righteous arrest.
Yeah.
You know, she did defend the arrest, and there were valid reasons for that arrest. I just want to point out one more thing. It's only when you sent me all the notes, or your day-by-day thing, and just something just jumped out at me, because you weren't there for it, but I was. The guard who arrested him was detective at the hospital in St. James's, was Detective Sergeant David Scahill.
Yes. And he gave evidence, yeah.
And he gave evidence, right? And he brought him down to Tullamore and, you know, everything. Detective Sergeant David Scahill was the third guard on the scene.
Wow, yeah.
And I've just seen your notes. He was, because there was Detective Tom Dunn, another guard, and David Scahill, and he gave evidence. I think he tried to save her as well. I was just reading your notes very, very quickly. But I found that really wonderful that they said, you're charging him. Or you're arresting him.
Saw it through, through to the end.
Saw it through.
And I'd say for many of the guards in this case, and the incredible work that they've done, it was probably incredibly personal for them and important for them that they got the right man. And they did get the right man, ultimately. I mean, the day after, literally the day after this person had been released, they got Jozef Puska in the hospital through extraordinary circumstances in its own right. I even remember when we were hearing they've got this fella in hospital. He's saying he was the victim of an attack in Blanchardstown, but they're looking at him for Tullamore. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the whole thing. But I think I was speaking to the extraordinary circumstances of that couple of days. And people might recall when they finally charged Jozef Puska and they brought him into the court that night, and it was a late night appearance. The absolute frenzy was unbelievable. There were hundreds and hundreds of people on the streets, and they crowded their way all around the courtroom. And utter madness had just descended on the area. It really showed you the visceral anger that this, the reaction that it got from people, the anger at the murder of Miss Murphy. Now, justice had to be seen to be done. At that point in time, people were nearly willing to tear Jozef Puska apart before he'd even been charged, before he even got into the courtroom. I remember filming it. I remember standing at the top of the steps, and I just had this instinct that I'm going to have to take the camera out because I didn't know what was going to happen. But I remember when they took him out of the van, they were screaming and shouted at him. But it was particularly after he was charged and they brought him back down the steps. And there were people going for him. Mm-hmm. And the guards were quite shaken in their own right because they had a duty of care. Obviously, they had to get him into the van and get him to prison. And I remember there were people there that legitimately would have beaten the absolute crap out of him, I'd say, had they got their hands on him. And it was just, that showed you the reaction that it had within the community and within the nation, like just the reaction to this murder. And then it also kind of paints the picture of the pressure that the guards were under. In spite of all that, everything that I've heard the last 16 days and everything that you've heard, I'm sure, shows you the meticulous nature of the case, the level and the breadth of evidence that they had against them, in spite of all that pressure, and in spite of the fact that they didn't even recover the murder weapon. They had his DNA under the fingernails, they had him on CCTV, and they had his confession, a breadth of evidence and witnesses in the case. I just can't imagine the pressure that they were under with the weight of all of that on top of them.
I think maybe we should speak to this. I thought it was a meticulous investigation. It really, really was. And, even people who made cameo appearances. I mean, I've done a piece in the Star and the Mirror about Inspector Shane McCartan, who wasn't even part of the investigation team, but it's just, I know somebody who knows him, and he said to me, I wish we had more Shane McCartans. He's a fantastic detective. And I thought that was a great line. I wonder, he effectively was the first person to nominate Puska because he put two and two together. Gardaí Newman, Conor Newman and Paul MacDonald came back after interviewing Puska in St. James going, this fella's not right. Mm-hmm. And it was then Detective Sergeant Shane McCartan, now Inspector McCartan, who went, all right, hold on. And obviously he'd heard the news and he put two and two together, and you know what? He got 4. And that, because I think we know that Puska doesn't have a record in Ireland. He wasn't known to Gardaí. Gardaí had a picture of Puska. They didn't know it was Puska. They were asking people, they were asking colleagues, who is this? Did anybody know who this is? And that's a sign that he wasn't known to them. So Shane McCartan did a fantastic piece of detective work there. But the whole unit, the whole team, Tullamore, Gardaí from Burr were brought in, the technical bureau, everybody. And for me, it was the NBCI, people like Maria Castles and Pádraig Hanley. Weren't they interviewing him?
They interviewed him.
It was meticulous, and they nailed him, and they really, really nailed him.
Yeah, and the prosecution in this case, prosecuting barrister Anne-Marie Lawler, also incredible and forensic in her detail. And in her cross-examination of Jozef Puska, I really felt for her in that moment where she said, I have a duty of care here. And she put it to him that there was no man, that he made up. And that she had to say that horrible line, really. But she had to, I think she was trying to just really hit him as hard as she could. You stabbed Ashling Murphy 11 times and you slit her throat and you watched her die. And he had the brazen neck on him and he was kind of sitting back in the chair. Sat back in the chair like this the whole time, and he just said, no, it wasn't me.
But it was.
But it was. And I also want to just compliment the family of Ashling Murphy, their stoic nature, the fact that they sat in the trial every single day. I had someone ask me about this recently, and they kind of said, I don't know how I could do that, but I think it's important for a family to see this process through. It was clearly important for the family of Ashling Murphy to sit there and face him every day, the man they probably knew from murdered their daughter. Her parents were there every day. Her boyfriend, Ryan Casey, was there every day. And there were very, very difficult moments where I kind
Mhm.
of thought a family shouldn't have to hear this. No one should have to hear this, but they sat through it all. One day sticks out for me, and that was the day that the pathologist, Dr. Sally Ann Collis, gave her evidence and went into forensic detail on how Ashling Murphy died. And the parents sat there through all of that. And I can recall, I mean, we were sitting in front of the family. I can recall Ashling's father was directly behind me. And he was just in bits. Like, I mean, he was crying. He was very, very emotional for him to hear that evidence. And I'm sure every day was difficult, but that day in particular was very, very hard just for a reporter to hear, let alone, the family were there hearing this detail for a lot of it for the first time, and that it was obviously important for them to hear it nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think it was the same day. These two things happened in the same day. I think some of all of Miss Murphy's clothing had been itemized by the forensics Garda from the technical bureau, and I remember she had it was a GAA top, a GAA tracksuit sort of top, and I remember it was green and blue, and I remember that being held up, and you could hear it was affecting the people behind. Oh, you're right, they were behind me. I was on that day, and then another time there was CCTV footage of Miss Murphy walking from her school to her car, and various things, and then there was CCTV footage of her walking to her death. She parked at the Dangan Road car park, went over the bridge, and then the second bridge, and was walking along the canal, and there was just a still of her.
Yeah,
and I can see the pink bobble hat.
Yeah,
and that was tough. That was really, really tough.
Well, yeah, that was shown again. There was a particular part where the CCTV images were kind of shown in a compilation, and that image was shown again. And I can recall Ashling Murphy's mother was very emotional at that point in time, was crying. It was very difficult. I remember Mr. Justice Hunt even noted it, that it was very difficult for the family, and he really felt for the family in that moment. In seeing, now he said that in the absence of the jury at the time, but emotions were very, very high. Seeing that image of Ashling Murphy, likely the last image of her before she went to her death. Another moment which we didn't really get to discuss was there was a witness who was being followed by Jozef Puska and could well have been his victim. He was clearly stalking for anyone at that point in time, because we saw footage of him following two women. One of the women wasn't even aware she was being followed, but this lady, Anne-Marie Kelly, knew and felt she was being followed, and said he was staring at her in an intimidating way. And she is very likely the last person to have seen Ashling Murphy alive. And she told how she met a woman with the pink hat, and how Ashling Murphy went down and petted her dog, and how she had a nice conversation with her and said she was a very pleasant young girl. I mean, it was just so harrowing to hear in the context. I mean, obviously everything is heard just kind of in sequence, and not really, the emotion doesn't come into it, but it dawned on me and probably others in the courtroom that this lady was describing meeting Ashling Murphy moments before she was set upon by Jozef Puska, having herself been followed by Jozef Puska, and in another set of events could easily have been his victim herself. It was just very harrowing stuff to hear.
Terrible. But there was justice today anyway.
Yes, it was. And I mean, cases get to you, but this one's really got to me covering it. I really, really feel for the family of Ashling Murphy in this. I hope that this does feel like justice. I know that in a way it probably doesn't. That no amount of years, no amount of time could ever bring back their daughter and Ryan's partner and their friend. But it's important that people get justice in the courts and a sense of closure. And I imagine a lot of this might be a sense of closure for the family in one sense, and a closing of the book. As awful as it was, I hope that they are able to have some sense of closure from this, and have some sense of peace from this. So may he rot, is all I would say.
And I share your hope, and I do believe it'll be an awful long time before Jozef Puska walks the streets. So here's to Ashling and to her family.
And thank you to everyone for following along our coverage through all of this. We may possibly do another pod, but this might be our last one. We'll see how things go. But if not, we'll maybe talk to you in the new year. We're going to take a little bit of a break, I think. Mick, what do you reckon?
Look, we do this. It's fantastic and it's brilliant, and it's a new form of journalism, but we do it on top of our ordinary journalism. So we tweet, we do 2 stories a day, we come back, we rush, we do it in our cars, we're all over the place. I'm doing it from the house, you're doing it from your house, we're up the high do, as we say up north. So look, we might do maybe 1 or 2 more, but I think we are going to take a break for a while. But Paul, thank you on a personal level. It's been great doing this with you, and it's been wonderful. And also to Kieran, who's gone but not forgotten.
Yeah, thanks to you, Mick, and thanks to Kieran. Kieran, he's not gone. He
no,
is. Made it sound like he's. Well, if he is listening, which fair play to you, Kieran, if you actually are still listening to us. But thanks very much for everything, and thank you, Mick, for putting up with me and for your coverage of this as well. Your fantastic coverage of the trial. And thanks to our listeners.
The most important people, thanks to our listeners.